The following podcast is based on real events. Hello and welcome to Spy Hard's podcast, where your hosts go deep undercover into the world of spy movies to decipher which films make the knock list. But remember this information, it's strictly for your ears only. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur.
But I think we should talk about our very special guest we have joining us today.
Indeed.
Joining us is MaryAnn Johanson. Hello, MaryAnn.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, we will crack on with the film in a little bit, but we like to hear the story of the guests. So I was speaking to you the other day off air and quite fascinated with your story. How did you get into, first of all, the website that you run and also films?
Well, I originally thought I wanted to make films. I went to New York University for a year for their film school, but the instant I got there, I realized it was not for me. Because I'd loved film since I was a kid, and I thought, let's make movies, and it wasn't going to work. Too much of a team effort, and I'm not a team player at all. I'm more of a lone wolf. So I left film school and I started working in publishing, but I had been writing all along. I started publishing science fiction fanzines when I was a teenager. This was back in the day when fanzines were Xerox and sent through the mail. This is before the internet. But then the internet started to come along and people were reviewing films online, and I thought, I could do that. So I started this little website in the personal web space that they gave you with an AOL account. This was in 1997, so this is quite a while ago. And really quickly outgrew that web space and then went into self-hosting. And since then, it sort of snowballed. I'm still doing it almost 25 years later, which is astonishing to me. I had no idea it would ever last this long. Sometimes people say things like, "Oh, if I'd known things were going to last this long, I would have done things differently." But I can't say that because no one knew where the web was going to go. The way the web happens now, could never have predicted it. So I just kind of always done what felt right at the time, and still sort of working. So I'm still here.
I can kind of relate to that story, actually, because I was always someone who was writing about film from a very, very young age. And they always have that adage of, well, film critics actually just want to be filmmakers. So I remember going to an orientation for film school and sitting there being like, I do not want to do this.
Yeah, I pretty quickly realized that I had made a mistake in going to film school. So, yeah, and right. So I did think I wanted to be a filmmaker. And then, I'm not a thwarted filmmaker. I was a thwarted film critic when I decided to go to film school, maybe.
Yeah, makes sense.
One thing you mentioned the other day was, I think it's been running since 1997, and the website is flickphilosopher.com, which we'll have a links to in the show notes below as well. But 97, I mean, I have a question. Did your website have one of those cursors like that had a shadow on it that chased it around, or did you have burning text or anything like the really classic websites?
I never did any gimmicky stuff like that. That stuff really annoyed me even back in the day when it was supposedly cool. No, it was pretty straightforward, pretty simple. I didn't even have photos because the web was really slow. Then you didn't use photos for things, so it was pretty much just pure text based. I played around with colors and things, but. Yeah, it was pretty simple and straightforward. And also, I was doing the coding by hand, and I sort of basically taught myself HTML by learning a language phonetically. It's like I figured out what things could do. So it was never really very complicated.
I mean, I remember when I started writing, it was 10 years after you, and I had the advantage of things like Blogger, which made it so much easier. I can't imagine coding.
Yeah, I actually, when blogging software started to come along, I sort of faked doing that, where the newer updates were up at the top of the page, but I had to do that all by hand. Mm-hmm. I moved to Movable Type, which is a blogging platform, I think in 2008 or so, something like that. So I had been going for more than 10 years before I finally made it easier on myself.
Wow.
Yeah.
As we're winding towards the film, the question I always like to ask our guests, and especially esteemed ones like yourself, is spy movies. It's what we talk about every week. What are some of your favorites?
I tend to go more towards the slightly humorous ones. Like, I love the Melissa McCarthy movie from a couple of years ago that's just called Spy, which is just absolutely brilliant, really funny, and really gets at tearing apart some of the tropes and the cliches of the genre. I really like that. I like the Austin Powers movies. I think they're a lot of fun. I do like the recent James Bond ones, the Daniel Craig movies. Don't love all of them, but when they're really good, like Skyfall and Casino Royale, I think are really amazing. So I'd probably go with those.
Well, it's very timely. Maybe, our listeners haven't come across your review. What did you think of No Time to Die?
It was okay. I didn't think it was great. I think it's way too long. And some of it feels really desperate. Some of it feels like the UK is trying to convince itself it's still a player on the world stage.
Yes, Scott.
which is I know. I mean, I live in the UK. I've been here for almost 11 years, and I love this country. And the fact that this just the little bit of time that delayed this film, when the impact of Brexit is finally hit, and people are really finally seeing, like, yeah, this whole global Britain thing is probably not going to work. I think this movie hits really differently now than it would have if it had been released when it was originally scheduled. So didn't hate it. Still like Craig as Bond. But yeah, I don't think it's one of the better outings for him.
Right.
Well, it's an interesting film. We had a good time discussing it a while back on the show, but it's not in my top Craigs, I don't think. It's definitely not up there with Skyfall and Casino Royale. But seeing as we're talking about Bond, do you have a Bond preference? Who's your Bond?
Well, I would say probably Daniel Craig. I think the first Bond that I saw was the Timothy Dalton one. I've never seen the Sean Connery ones or the Roger Moore ones. I know it's embarrassing. But it kind of, they never really quite appealed to me. I'll probably go back and watch them at some point. But yeah, the Timothy Dalton one I think was the first one that I saw. But yeah, I got to go with Daniel Craig, I think.
That's entirely fair.
I would recommend watching From Russia with Love to start maybe with the Connerys, because that one's very Hitchcockian, and they don't quite know what the Bond formula is yet, so they're really looking to things like North by Northwest for inspiration.
It's one of those things where the films have been so influential and so pervasive in pop culture that I sort of feel like I've seen them. I know that's often a misapprehension, but they're so everywhere that I feel like I probably have a good sense of the Bond, of the early Bond stuff, even without having seen the films. But yeah, I do need to rectify that.
Well, maybe moving on from slapstick and comedy spy films, let's talk about the film we're discussing this week. It's definitely not a comedy. No. Cam, what have we got?
Yes, we are tackling Kathryn Bigelow's 2012 film, Zero Dark 30.
So, this is going to be an interesting one, because I think we've got 3 different countries represented here. I mean, MaryAnn, you live in the UK now, but you're, of course, an American. Mm-hmm. I'm British, Cam's a Canadian, and this film has a lot to do with geopolitics and maybe your thoughts on certain things. But I think what we'll do first is talk about our original experiences with the film. So, Cam, you first. I mean, did you see this in theaters? Do you have any memory of it at all?
Yeah, I do. I did see this in theaters. This was one of the Oscar, type movies, one of the prestige films of the season. There's always one that does not open before the end of the year, which is a nightmare when it comes to writing my top 10 of the year list. There's always one, and it drives me crazy. This was the one that I had to see in January of 2013, and it had a lot of hype going in, and I was a big fan of The Hurt Locker, and I remember enjoying the movie. I looked up my original grade. I gave it a really positive grade, but it wasn't one that I think I felt passionate about at the time. I wonder if it was almost too much recency, where it was okay, I've just heard about all these news events the last couple of years. Now I'm watching the movie chronicling them. It feels a little too soon, or maybe I'm a little exhausted on this sort of thing. But I did really admire how technically well made it was and the performances. So it was a movie I walked out positive on, but also not swept up on. And I will say, the difference in time was very interesting when it came to rewatching this movie.
Yeah, it's like what's his name? Elton John doing the story of his life in film while he's still alive.
Yeah,
it's that odd thing that some people do. MaryAnn, what about you?
Well, I saw the film at a press screening, or even possibly it might have been an awards screening, which are screenings that are for press, but also for people who work in the industry who will be voting on Oscars and other awards things. But it was definitely before it was released. And I went back and read my original review from the time, and I was pretty gung-ho on the film, except for I did feel that it's a bit pro-torture. It's a bit misleading in the sense that it, gives the idea that actionable intelligence was gotten from torture, which we know is not true. We know that torture doesn't work. And I felt it was a bit gung-ho pro-American, and I'm very, very lefty, progressive. I'm sympathetic to the idea that, people might not like Americans storming into their country unannounced and uninvited, with military to catch a bad guy. So that did bother me a little bit, but the performances are incredible. It's very gripping. When we're talking about spy stuff, it's probably one of the more realistic films about what it means to actually be some sort of covert agent or what we would call a spy. That it's, it's not all out in the field with a gun. It's not James Bond. It's sitting at a desk and, digging through paperwork and videos and stuff. So I feel in that sense, there's certainly some positive stuff to be had from this.
Okay.
Certainly. I mean, I do think it's a good film.
Well, I mean, just for me, I didn't catch this at the cinema. I was just getting into the point where I would listen for hype with films, and the hype was quite palpable for this film. So when it came on home release, I remember picking it up. I don't know if it was a rental or I bought a DVD of it. I had the DVD. I remember enjoying it, but it didn't really leave much of a lasting impression on me, despite this film touching on things like 7/7, which is a very important moment to me. I have a personal connection to that day. I don't find myself being particularly go get 'em, which I think this film maybe relies on a little bit, but we'll perhaps get into that. But yeah, I remember enjoying it, but not being blown away.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I do remember thinking, and I mentioned it in my review at the time, is that I did wonder whether it was too soon, like you were saying about Elton John making a movie while he's still alive about himself. Yeah, I did feel like, are we still too close to this to have the kind of perspective that a film like this needs? And I'm still not sure about that.
Okay. Well, I think for our listeners that maybe haven't seen it in a while or haven't caught the film, what we'll do is we'll turn to Old Faithful, the letterboxd.com synopsis. 0 Dark 30, the greatest manhunt in history. A chronicle of the decade-long hunt for Al-Qaeda terrorist leader Osama bin Laden after the September 2001 attacks, and his death at the hands of the Navy SEAL Team 6 in May 2011.
I guess that doesn't really sum up the plot of the movie or the character who's driving the story, but sure. Yeah.
Basically tells you the ending.
Yeah. That makes it sound a lot more sort of bland and dull than it is. I mean, as a film, it's exciting in the sense that it's basically a gripping procedural. It's a detective story. It's a mystery. It's that the dogged detective who's will not let go of this.
I mean, to be fair to Letterboxd, it tends to be people that will submit these synopses. So I probably wrote this. I don't know. It's probably done by computers or AI or something. Well, MaryAnn, I'm glad you've joined us. But before we get into the review proper, Cam, I need some intel. And frankly, I do not want to use any enhanced interrogation techniques on you. So how did this film come to be?
So this was the second collaboration of director Kathryn Bigelow, coming off of her Oscar win for The Hurt Locker, and she was reteaming with that film's writer, Mark Boal. And Mark Boal was the writer-producer on that film as well as this one. And in his backstory, he was a journalist who'd worked in a lot of hot zones, he'd embedded with troops, he'd covered the War on Terror for quite a while. So it made a lot of sense for him to perhaps make a movie like this. And they decided, coming off The Hurt Locker, which won Best Picture, it won her Best Director, it won Best Screenplay, it was a kind of a big deal, that maybe they could get a blank check movie made. Like maybe they could cash in on the success of The Hurt Locker and get something that maybe a studio wouldn't be crazy about made. And that kind of wasn't the case because Hurt Locker wasn't really a financial success. It was actually at the time the lowest grossing Best Picture winner, I believe, to date.
But it was just a Best Picture winner, so people loved it, but no one went to see it.
Correct. So
that's that typical critic situation, isn't it? Where it's like, it's a critical darling, and every cinema going is like, I don't care.
Yeah, and since then it's become super common. Movies like
Yeah.
Moonlight, for example. Yeah, it's just like nowadays, Nomadland, another one. We give Best Pictures to really great movies, but ones no one really wants to see.
I think that's probably more of an endemic problem in cinema than necessarily the Oscars, but anyway.
For sure. And they were looking to make a different kind of war film. They wanted to make it about the ill-fated attempts to capture Osama bin Laden in the wake of 9/11. That was the plan. The ill-fated attempts. And so they decided to build it around the 2001 Battle of Tora Bora, which was the attempt early in the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan to take down bin Laden in the cave complex in Tora Bora. And they spent over a year researching and writing this film and going back and forth with the CIA. Mark Boal had a lot of CIA contacts with his past as a journalist. And so this was going to be a very elaborate film about, a foiled attempt ultimately to get some sort of justice post 9/11. The studio, as you can imagine, they were not thrilled. They were like, really? This is the movie you want to make? Okay.
But they were given the carte blanche because of the Hurt Locker.
No. The studios were like, no, we're not paying for this.
Oh, okay.
So they instead wrote the movie Triple Frontier. And the idea would be maybe that would be their next film. And ultimately that movie just stalled at Paramount and it just never ended up happening with them. More on Triple Frontier later down the road. Ultimately, they were able to secure $45 million in independent financing through Megan Ellison's Annapurna Pictures. Are you aware of who Megan Ellison is, Scott?
No.
Okay, she is the 26-year-old daughter of Oracle CEO Larry Ellison. She is a billionaire heiress who is a huge movie fan, and around this time decided, I'm getting into the movie business and I'm going to start paying for a lot of the movies I would like to see. So if there was interesting directors out there looking to make oddball movies, Megan Ellison was the person they were running to finance them, and she financed a lot of great movies.
Do you happen to know if she likes podcasts?
She's not going to pay for your Patreon, Scott.
Someone should.
So Megan Ellison agreed to fund them and gave complete creative and business control to Kathryn Bigelow. So yeah, that's kind of what the perfect situation is, folks in Hollywood. Now, they were putting the finishing touches on this project, and then the phones rang, and the President Obama announcement that SEAL Team 6 had killed bin Laden was airing, and they were like, oh, well, our entire original movie no longer stands up. We have to basically... I don't know. Initially, they thought maybe they could just tack on a different ending. And then they realized, no, the entire purpose of the entire movie thematically just collapsed. There was no movie there anymore.
But they made, World War II films about stuff in the war, not the end of the war every time. Why couldn't they have told this story?
Because thematically, it was about America's failed attempts. That was the entire point of the film.
As in, they'll never get him.
Yeah.
Right, I see that. Okay. Yeah, I can see why you might want to pivot.
Yeah, so as soon as this news broke, Sony was hopping on the phone and being like, please, 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 we want to distribute your movie. This project was going around. Suddenly, this was the hot project to make, and studios wanted to get it out there for the public. And so, roughly a year and a half later, they had Zero Dark 30. They had to basically rewrite most of it. They've said that the only bit from the original vision of this movie is the opening with the black screen and the audio from 9/11.
Oh, not even the black site stuff, but literally just that black screen and the phone calls.
That is the only bit carried over from the original script.
Huh. Okay. That's barely anything. That's a completely new script then, really.
Mm-hmm. And they shot the movie in India and Jordan over 14 weeks, which is actually a very short production schedule for a movie that's pretty dense and elaborate. There's a lot going on in that movie. That's a fast shoot.
There is, but there's no, CG or anything like that. It's very practical.
Yeah, but you think about staging the entire last half hour of this movie, that would have taken quite a while.
I mean, I don't make films, so I'll take your word for it.
And they ultimately produced 2 million feet of film, which required 2 editors working in tandem to put it together. So, there was a lot shot for this movie, and the fact you have 2 editors needed to assemble this thing in time shows you that Kathryn Bigelow had really big ambitions for this film.
Well, I'd like to think they paid off, but we'll get into that in a bit.
And as I said, the movie had a budget of $45 million. Domestically, it did $95.7, international $37.1, for a worldwide total of $132.8 million.
So is that more successful than The Hurt Locker?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Jeremy Renner.
Indeed. It was number 57 for the year between Las Vegas.
That's
you remember Las Vegas?
Yeah, I like that film.
Okay, that's, was it Michael Douglas, Morgan Freeman, a bunch of old men go to Vegas?
Isn't it Michael Caine as well?
Oh boy, there's a Patreon episode coming up.
Oh boy, we got some Vegas stories we can tell you.
So Las Vegas beat it by just a little, but Zero Dark 30 did beat Ghost Rider, Spirit of Vengeance.
Oh. I actually haven't seen either of the Ghost Rider films.
Oh really? Oh, that's crazy.
Is it?
Well, I don't know. They were sort of an interesting artifact of that era where studios were making comic book movies, but not quite sure yet how to do it, or at least not sure how to lock into a winning formula time and time again.
Wasn't it under the Marvel Knights umbrella?
Yeah, it was.
It was those two films and something else, I think. Spawn? No, that's not Marvel.
It was only the second Ghost Rider, and it was the two Punisher movies.
Ah, yes. Okay, the Punisher films. That makes sense.
Because the second Ghost Rider was kind of a loose reboot, and it was a little more violent than the original. The original was more of a just down the middle of the road blockbuster.
Like Evil Dead 2 style, where it's kind of the same film twice.
Sort of, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they shifted up kind of locations, villains, all that sort of stuff, but it was a little similar. Not a remake, though. Not a full remake. Just kind of a loose reboot where it was, let's cut loose most of the ties to the original cast and stuff like that.
But wasn't Nicolas Cage in both?
Yeah, he's the only thing that really carries over.
And carry over, I'm sure he does.
He does. The top three for this year, number 1 was The Avengers, number 2 was Skyfall, and number 3 was The Dark Knight Rises. And this movie did very well with Oscar nominations. It won Best Sound Editing, but was nominated for Best Picture, Best Actress, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Editing.
Not a bad haul. What did Hurt Locker get? Best Picture?
Best Picture, Best Screenplay, Best Editing, Best Director. Those are the ones I remember.
And was this Bigelow's two films back to back?
Yes, this was her follow-up to The Hurt Locker. So this was her back at the Oscars 2 years later, 3 years later.
That ain't bad.
No, but you're less likely to win the second time. They're like, okay, we've got to spread the wealth around a little more.
Has she won again since?
No.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So, a couple other notes. In 2019, the movie Triple Frontier was made, and it was rewritten and directed by J.C. Shandor, who'd done movies like All Is Lost and A Most Violent Year. And I believe Ben Affleck was one of the stars. It was sort of an ensemble. It was a Netflix production, as I recall. It was very forgettable. It had some interesting elements, but not a movie. I suspect the version that wound up on Netflix was very different than what Bull and Bigelow would have intended.
I hear Netflix and I immediately get nervous.
Yeah. And Kathryn Bigelow and Mark Bull would reteam for 2017's Detroit, which was about the 1967 police response to a riot, and has a lot of very uncomfortable material like Zero Dark 30 does. And it would be a movie that would be very polarizing, didn't really win over a lot of audiences.
I actually saw that film.
Yeah, I did too in theaters.
I didn't like it.
I did like it, but it's not a pleasant sit, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think that's probably what it was. I'm not one of these guys that goes looking for Oscar films to watch or anything like that. I just go for entertainment. I don't think I was the target audience particularly, and it was uncomfortable to watch. Some harsh truths there, which is kind of what cinema can do and should do. I just don't really feel like I was in the right frame of mind to watch it. But is John Boyega in that one?
Yep.
He had a good performance in that.
Yeah, and Will Poulter was very good as a deeply, deeply horrible person.
Well, that's what I hear about him anyway, so that's fine.
Fair enough. Yeah, watch Midsommar. That's also the case there. And just a final note. This is kind of a weird one. After this movie was released, the CIA had to do 2 internal investigations about the relationships the filmmakers had with the CIA. It seems there was a lot of gifts being passed around. There was some invites to secret events. And they completely overhauled the procedures for the CIA dealing with the entertainment industry in the wake of Zero Dark 30.
Some really bad tradecraft right there.
Right, that you could not have summed it up better. So that wraps me up on the behind the scenes.
Well, that was the story of how Zero Dark 30 came to be. But what I want to know is, how do we feel about it almost 10 years later? Now, we all seem to about enjoyed it when we watched it. It wasn't like we were all blown away. But I want to throw it to MaryAnn, you're our guest first. Now you've revisited it in 2021. Fresh eyes. What do you think?
Yeah. I don't see the sort of the rah-rah pro-America stuff like I did back then. The pro-torture stuff still is a worrisome aspect of the film. But I do think that I want to say the urgency of what America got itself into after 9/11 is sort of depicted here. But it's kind of not urgent either because, as you said, this takes place over more than 10 years. I think it's a really tough film to look back on and remember what it felt like to be. And I'm a New Yorker. I was in New York on 9/11, and the push to punish people, to find the perpetrators, and make sure they paid for what they did was really strong among even the most pacifistic sort of people. And I think there's sort of like this slow burn in this film that kind of captures that. I think looking back on this film now, the thing that might end up being most valuable about it, in the decades to come, might be the sense of capturing that feeling in America at that time. So in one way, maybe it was good that someone made this film soon after the events that were depicted, just as like this time capsule of emotion, however you want to judge it from now. And I think seeing what's happened in the Middle East and especially in Afghanistan in the wake of all of this, we probably could have done a lot better. But that judgment is, for the future to make on us. It's a hard film to have a purely enthusiastic response to. It's obviously really well made, craft-wise, incredible performances, incredible cast, really well written as a thriller. But it's all tied up in, the complicated reality that's depicting, and it's really hard for me to unpick that still.
I think it's a very valid point, and you were in New York when September 11th happened. That means this whole thing has this very personal meaning to you and to the world by extension, but especially to you. You were there.
Yeah.
And I always think about United 93. That's made 5 years later.
Yeah.
That's pretty raw. That's pretty close to everything.
That is extremely raw. Yeah. I mean, I saw that at a press screening when the film was new, and it was really difficult to watch. I haven't seen it again. I'm not sure that I would want to, because it was really tough.
Yeah, that's one of those like masterpieces that you're like, that's a one and done for me. I can never do it again.
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, I don't know. I mean, this is about United 93. I don't know if this is worth mentioning, and feel free to cut this if it doesn't work. But there's one of the things that was interesting about United 93 is that they had like a lot of air traffic controllers playing air traffic controllers in the film. I don't know if you remember that. But there was one of the air traffic controllers in the film is a real air traffic controller who lives next door to my parents, and I babysat his kids, so I know him. And I don't think I knew that he was in the film. And it was real, you talk about like a film hitting home, but like it literally did for me. I don't think he wasn't on duty on 9/11, but the fact that somebody that I knew was basically replicating his work on screen was really, really weird feeling.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Well, I remember there was a film, and I've not seen it, Cam, but you were telling me about it a while ago when we discussed something similar to this. But there was like 3 soldiers on a train.
Oh, yeah.
Then they were playing themselves.
1517 to Paris, yeah.
Oh, that's a terrible, terrible film.
That was my pick as the worst movie of that year that it came out. I could not stand that movie.
I mean, those guys did a good, important thing, but the film, they should not have been playing themselves, for one thing. That was no.
How close to that was that to the event?
I mean, just a couple of years, probably.
Yeah, it was
maybe even less than that. It was very close.
It was a little bit of that Zero Dark 30 of following very closely after the event.
Yeah, but without any sort of distance or, some of the criticism, positive and negative, of Zero Dark 30 was that it was journalistic.
Yeah.
In the sense that it was, trying to sort of follow the events, but it doesn't have a lot of balance as journalism. But there was you can argue about how journalistic Zero Dark 30 is. There is no aspect of journalism in that 1517 to Paris film. None. It's pure hagiography of these guys.
Yeah, and about an hour of travelogue.
Yeah, and they're just not that interesting as movie characters.
No.
Like I said, they did a good thing. Good for them. They deserve to be praised for that, but that doesn't automatically make for a great story.
No.
Well, I suppose I'll chime in with my thoughts about it now. It's hard to follow you up, MaryAnn, because I think you hit a lot of the points I thought about it as well. I just think it's a solid film. Overall, it works. It's one of those films I feel like you have to pay attention to, and it keeps your attention. It's something we've struggled with in the past on this show, is some of these spy films that need you to pay attention, but don't hold your attention, so you wander off. Whereas this one is pretty gripping. There's tension from scene one to the end.
Yeah, and it's 2 hours and 40 minutes long almost, and it doesn't feel like it. It never drags. It keeps you engaged the whole way.
Absolutely, and I think that that's testament to the director and to the performances as well. But I think I was worried about going back into this just for sort of the jingoism of it all, like the uber patriotic side of things, and it really wasn't there. I seem to have it in my memory that it was, but when I watched it again, I didn't feel that.
Exactly the same for me. Maybe the emotions were just a lot more raw at the time, and so now we've got a bit more distance.
I think again, it's quite remarkable that they didn't lean into that as much, because they could have easily done it.
Yeah.
Oh, you imagine the Michael Bay version of this or something. Like, it would have been a nightmare.
Well, that's what was it? 13 Soldiers.
13 Hours was it?
It
was like
the one about the
Benghazi.
The Benghazi. Yeah. Horrible.
Yeah.
I think I wrote down it's hard to watch but hard to look away. And you mentioned the torture stuff. Some of the things they did in reality that this film is trying to portray, and it doesn't even particularly portray it to its full extent, some of the acts that were done in places like Guantanamo Bay. But it asks the question a little bit, does the ends justify the means? But I don't feel like it really dives into that for me. There's that side of it that I think is a little bit short. So I didn't really like that. And I've got some gripes, but I think overall it works as a spy film. It's enjoyable, and it's one of those things that keeps your interest. This is what I look for. But what do you think, Cam?
Yeah, it was one that I actually had some hesitation almost about revisiting, because while I'd liked it the first time around, it was something that it has a little bit of that United 93. Do I want to go back and watch this story again, especially when it still feels relatively fresh in my mind? I found myself much more sucked into just the storytelling this time around. I mean, Kathryn Bigelow, fantastic filmmaker. I love The Hurt Locker, and so much of the intensity of The Hurt Locker is just filtered in through all the procedural elements of this movie, where a different filmmaker, this could have been a chore to sit and watch them hop through year after year of paperwork and false leads. Like, we've all seen that movie that's trying to string together events like this, and it's just falling flat. Scott, think of The House on 92nd Street.
I knew you were going to mention that bloody film. I do not recommend you watch that film, MaryAnn.
I don't think I've seen that one. Okay, I'll avoid it.
Yeah. To me, it really does work as sort of, as MaryAnn said, a portrait of that time, that very particular time. It's a movie that's come under fire over the years for its accuracy. Mark Bowl has kind of skirted around a little bit of like, well, it is a movie. It's not necessarily fact, but it's also making a lot of statements about things that just weren't particularly accurate. But there's a number of entertainments that were produced around this time commenting on the feelings surrounding 9/11 that I think we look at now and say like, oh, that's kind of messy. But there's like an immediacy to it that's very true to how we felt. Scott, we're both Star Trek fans. Season 3 of Enterprise is... You too? Oh, MaryAnn, perfect.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, Season 3 of Enterprise is all of this response to 9/11. And it's something that now they look at and go, well, boy, we're a little uncomfortable with some of what we did. But I look at it and go, it's very important for how people were feeling at this moment. And
Yeah.
I mean, I'll be curious how future generations look at the events of the killing of bin Laden. At the time, like, there was a real sense of almost just like relief of like, okay, it's over, ha ha ha, look where we are now. But there was a sense of like, okay, something's been done about this situation. And to revisit the movie now was just like, we talked about The Day of the Jackal, right? Which has a real immediacy, and it's another procedural that really worked for me. And this one just has, for me, more of an emotional connection than the potential assassination of Charles de Gaulle. So I think it holds up really, really strongly as a film, and we're just going to have to debate years going forward how we feel about it as a historical document.
Well, I was going to bring this up later, maybe in my sort of dislike/quibbles section, but I think it's quite prescient to talk about it now. I think our experiences of this film are different, and it will be based on country, affiliation. Now, when Osama bin Laden was killed, I didn't feel a sense of catharsis. People weren't punching the air in the UK as far as I'm aware, but I know that was happening in the States.
It was, and I didn't feel a sense of catharsis either, and I was actually pretty repulsed seeing the way some people were reacting, like we'd won the Super Bowl or something. I mean, that was really uncomfortable and unpleasant, and yeah, I mean, one of my gripes with the film is that, and I still have it on second viewing, is that, we're supposed to be the good guys. We're supposed to be the ones who, we don't execute somebody without a trial, even the worst of monsters. That's what all the Nuremberg trials were about, prosecuting people who did that and treating even the worst of criminals with due process and in a civilized way. And we didn't do that with bin Laden. It would have been, I mean, I understand there were all these arguments at the time about how that you couldn't have a fair trial, or what do you do with this guy? And I get that, but I'm not sure that the way that we dealt with it was particularly helpful either. It didn't hold America up in a great light.
I wouldn't. I'm not sure I would throw any blame around people's reactions. I think a lot of people's connections to this is very personal. And some people it affects them in that level. And I suppose my question I was getting to was,
sorry.
no, it's fine. This is good. But my question is, do you think it changes per country? Because I feel that there's a sense of connection that I don't have to this film, and I won't ever have to this film, just because I'm British. And I was wondering from both of you, because both North Americans, did you feel that there was that there for you, or do you feel that doesn't exist at all?
I don't know. I mean, I was already living in London when I saw the film. Which obviously is a couple of years after the events it's depicting, but I don't know. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's not something that I've thought about before. What you're saying makes perfect sense. That's probably inevitable, actually, that different reactions are going to come from different perspectives.
I mean, you could talk about Spy Kids. I don't think people's reactions to that are going to be any different, because it's a kids film.
It's just pure fantasy.
And that's it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But this is a reality-based story, and it's a very recent one, and it has and it's a shared trauma that we have all survived in one way or another.
Yeah.
I mean, as I say, 7/7 is an important thing to me, and that gets a good 30 seconds in the film.
Yeah.
Lip service, basically, but that's fine. But maybe Cam, is there any connection on your side of things? Do you feel that extra connection because you're from North America?
I think just our proximity and closeness to the U.S. We read a lot of U.S. news. We're pretty up to date on what's going on in the U.S. And obviously Canada relies on the U.S. for a lot as well. And so, like, when all the 9/11 stuff was going on, like, we were just glued to the TVs, and there was. I tend to find Canada will often, when there's threats towards the U.S., Canada takes them extremely seriously because it could impact us as well. So there was a fear really coming out of 9/11 that things could happen in Canada, and there was an attack in Toronto. There have been incidents in Canada, and so I do recall at the time like that real sense of like we were with the U.S. on what they wanted to do. And it didn't mean we weren't critical of things along the way, but there was a support for what the U.S. was going through very strongly coming from Canada.
Well, I mean, arguably you could say that about the UK as well.
If you go back to Blair, he
Yeah.
was complicit with Bush in what happened as an initial knee-jerk reaction to
Exactly. Yeah.
9/11, and that the politics of that is quite bad to look back on. And I'm a far left guy myself in that sense. Blair is a Labour, there's all that sort of thing connected to it. But I suppose I just didn't feel that sort of personal connection to this story, and I just wondered if you guys felt that. It seems like maybe there is something, but not too deep.
Yeah, I would say that's a good way to characterize it. Yeah, definitely a personal connection to the feeling that the film is sort of trying to capture in a sort of a subtextual sense, but not so deep that I don't feel I can be a slightly, take a step back and take a look at the bigger picture.
You don't lose your
Yeah.
objectivity.
I don't think, well, I was going to say that, but I've often made a point of saying that there's no such thing as being objective about any kind of work of art. So, but yeah, not so subjective that I can't, just detach myself from the emotion of what it makes me feel to look at the rest of it. Yeah, it's a naughty, complicated thing.
It is, and these real events are, especially the recent things, and yeah, it's a shared trauma, as I said.
It is interesting when you invited me to come and talk about this movie in particular. My first response was, and my emotional response was, wait, is this a spy film? Because in my head, I tend to think of spy films as being sort of fantastical and escapist, like the Bond movies, even when they sort of touch on, real geopolitical stuff, or can at least in the subtext be seen as applicable to something that's really happening. That I tend not to think of spy films as something like this, but it absolutely is a spy film. I can't deny that. But that was my first reaction was, wait, is this a spy film? Okay, yeah, I guess it is. I think we often maybe look to movies, especially like the Bond films and certainly the comedy spy stuff that I like, as escapist, and there's nothing escapist about this movie.
No, not at all. Like
nothing.
even The Day of the Jackal, which I cited earlier, is like this sort of harsh docudrama chronicling an assassination there in that film. That has more relief than this movie.
Yeah, or even like another one. I know you guys know I like this one because you referenced it in one of your other episodes. Bridge of Spies is a wonderful film. It feels escapist and to a certain degree to me, but maybe that's because everything that it depicts happened before I was even born. So there's extra distance to that.
Yeah, and that's
yeah.
One thing about the movie, though, I'll say is like Bigelow, and the script is by Mark Bull. It doesn't feel like it's getting swept up in an emotional story as much. Like it feels like they're actually trying to do it from a distanced approach, which I really appreciate, because you get the passion of the character, the lead character played by Jessica Chastain, Maya. They let the movie filter through her intensity towards achieving this goal, but it doesn't feel like the filmmakers are, bringing in the John Williams score or trying to kind of make it feel like an easy entertainment that you can just kind of bask in the way you can a Bridge of Spies, a movie I really, really enjoyed. It feels like they're like, what, for better or worse, we are going to give a chronicle of this time period and let it stand as it stands, whether you enjoy it or not. And that's something I really noticed. You look on, say, like a Metacritic. Critics love this movie. Like this was like, I think, a 95 out of 100 or something like that. Whereas like audiences were much more subdued. Your average moviegoer, ranking this movie online, much lower.
Maybe that's just the escapist element people look for. That MaryAnn was saying about we crave that 2.5 hours in the cinema where we don't get to live our lives, and this actually just reminds us of how bad it can be out here.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Well, let's maybe talk about maybe not the lighter side of this film. There isn't much in terms of a lighter side, but like the things that we liked, the stuff we enjoyed, and we've spoken about the direction. We've enjoyed that. I want to just say Jessica Chastain is fantastic in this film. She's probably the strongest performance in this film by a country mile. And I could list a bunch of nice words about her, but I'll just leave it at that. She's fantastic.
Well, she is the strongest performance in the film, but she's also the central character by far. I mean, there's hardly a scene that she's not in. And the movie, as you were saying, totally is carried on the intensity of her character and her unrelenting dedication to this one chore of finding bin Laden, which she does for more than a decade. This character is based on a real person. So it's not like she's a composite character, but she's not that far apparently from the reality of this real person.
Yeah, the original person I believe was named Jen. Like that was the CIA name was Jen. And it's as you said, composite character in that she definitely covers more ground than Jen would have. But in terms of just I think the personality and the intensity and just the drive to achieve this goal, very much is drawn from that character.
Yeah.
And I think the film is very clever in how it uses Jessica Chastain's character, because it shows you the nitty-gritty that she has to go through to get there, and it makes it believable, and it leads it more towards that docudrama angle that it's going for. But I did have a quibble with how she's introduced, because especially in that interrogation scene, you can see that she's uncomfortable. There's like little quick shots of her face looking like she's not enjoying herself. I mean, who would be? But, they're playing her as this timid person, but really she is I think they use some sort of animal analogy for her, tiger or something like that. But she's holding it back, and I thought that was a weird choice to start off with.
See, interesting. I didn't see her as timid in that first scene. What I did see was maybe she wasn't quite prepared for the horror of the interrogation and the torture that she was going to see, and that doesn't sit well with her. And as the film goes on, well, only early on are there the torture scenes, but we see her control that sort of horror at what she's seeing a little better, but it still affects her. There's one scene later in the film where she's in an interrogation and she's not physically interacting with the prisoner, but there's one bit where she taps the soldier next to her and he attacks the guy that they're interrogating. And she's in the interrogation, she's very stolid and hard. But the instant she walks out, she doesn't quite collapse, but she just, you see that it's affecting her. So to me, I just saw it more as a matter of how she was controlling her emotions rather than not feeling them, or just sort of keeping them inside until she could let them out.
And you have the scene too where the guy is left alone with her and tries to appeal to her, and probably thinking, well, she'll be softer, and she really isn't. Like, you get the hardness of that character, where I do imagine this is a character who's obviously very hard-edged. Probably the reality of seeing that situation, you see her kind of reacting to the smell in the room, for example. I'm sure the horror of that moment is hitting her, but I get the sense she's someone who'd be willing to, pull the trigger on people, no problem.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah, maybe it's more like a visceral reaction that she has, like you say, to the smell, and not so, I mean, the fact that she's there in the first place at all suggests that she's not averse to the idea of what's happening. It's just the sort of in your face reality of it she has to get a bit adjusted to. I do like that this film does not ever show anyone enjoying the torture. It doesn't linger on what they're doing to their prisoners. I mean, the film could have been a lot more exploitive. It could have been exploitive, and it's not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It sort of is depicting the reality of what was going on without reveling in it, or So it's pro-torture to a degree, but not to the point where it says that anyone's actually enjoying this, which, thank God.
Yeah, it's depiction, not, I think, cheering it on as this is really a great thing we were doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'll throw it out. We've had Jessica Chastain, but MaryAnn, what's something else you enjoyed about the film?
Well, the supporting cast is 201, amazing, and certainly in retrospect, when you go back, 10 or more years later and look at it, you're like, oh my God, there's Chris Pratt is in there, Jeremy Strong shows up, Mark Strong, all these people. You're like, oh yeah, I forgot they were in here. Joel Edgerton, John Barrowman, James Gandolfini. Amazing. I totally forgot he was in this.
Frank Grillo.
So
I was shocked when Frank Grillo popped up for one brief moment, and I actually paused it to look up.
Bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the supporting cast is incredible. Really, Jason Clarke. I mean, he's really really amazing actor. Really like him. Jennifer Ehle.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. I like that that Jessica Chastain was not the only woman in the film, because that is a bugbear of mine, where there's one girl and the whole guy gang. So that was good. Yeah, I mean, and everybody just is so there in the moment, whether they're like, the guy behind the desk, or there's that one scene, I think it's the first appearance by Mark Strong, where he comes in to berate the team in Pakistan, and he's just screaming at them. And it's great. It's such an amazing performance.
I will just ask about Mark Strong, because I was very curious. Do you think I could get away with his wig? Could I pull that off?
I think you probably could. Yeah. Go for it.
As you know, listeners, I am follically challenged, and Mark Strong turns up in a very convincing wig. So I need to contact his. Is it croupier? No, that's for horses.
Contact croupier.
I don't know. Yeah, I probably need some horsehair up in here, so that's
there
fine.
You go.
I think you should try it.
No, that Mark Strong scene really jumped out to me. It's almost like the Alec Baldwin, Glengarry Glen Ross moment, where like this character just comes in, steals the scene, and just you're like, wow, like who was that guy? And yeah, like that supporting cast just through and through. I thought Jason Clarke was phenomenal. I can't say that when I saw it the first time around, he leaped off the screen to me. And then, of course, years after this, we would get several Jason Clarke starring vehicles. Hollywood would really run with him for a while there.
Mm-hmm.
And this character I just found so interesting, because you see the horrors he's doing. You completely buy into, or not buy into, but like understand the process of how this is happening through him, and like the psychology that he's using. You're understanding through his character. Just really scary, terrifying stuff. And the way he just kind of walks out and is very nondescript. And you see him later in the movie working in, offices in Washington. It's just like, how does this man disconnect from this? Like, I would watch it. And they always say one of the compliments to like a supporting character is I would watch an entire movie about that character's life. I would love to know what's going on with Jason Clarke, because it's a movie I've cited a lot on the podcast. I don't, just coincidence, I guess, but it just reminded me of Oscar Isaac in The Card Counter. I'm like, I want to know what this guy's up to when he's not, part of these missions.
I was going to bring up The Card Counter. I wondered if you guys had seen it, because that, without spoiling it too much for people who haven't seen it, which is probably most people at this point, it does have a sort of connection to this film in one way. If you haven't seen the trailers for Card Counter, you wouldn't know that there's this connection, but it's an interesting companion piece to Zero Dark 30. Because I guess it's not too much of a spoiler to say that the Oscar Isaac character is a soldier who fought in the war on terror and has been haunted by what he's done during it. Because, so you can maybe Jason Clarke will meet up with Oscar Isaac and play cards.
I would watch that movie. I'm sure their conversations would be fascinating.
Yeah. It's so funny. There was a bit in the film in Zero Dark 30 where Jessica Chastain is approaching, she's back in Washington, she's approaching the office of her superior, or maybe it's still in Pakistan, but anyway, they're in an office setting, and the guy's on the phone and just hear his voice at first, and I went, oh my God, that's Oscar Isaac. And it turns out it wasn't when we see him. But I thought, wow, if he showed up in here, because he's done a couple things with Jessica Chastain now. So I was sorry that I was wrong about that, but that would have been fun.
Well, I mean, just speaking of the supporting cast, I think one of the film's strengths is that it knows when to drop people.
Yeah.
Like, you've got people like Mark Strong and James Gandolfini, but they're only in it for a few scenes, and it doesn't need any more because it knows who its central character is, and it's not wasting minutes on other people's stories when really you know what you're here to see, and you know who your lead character is that's taking you to that end goal. Mm-hmm. So why would I want to spend another half an hour with Jason Clarke? But it leaves you wanting more, and that's the key.
Yeah, Edgar Ramirez, another one. He's one of the soldiers who helps them pinpoint. He's terrific. I would love to know more about him.
Yeah, like Scott, we talked about Operation Crossbow, which featured many scenes of character actors in rooms talking, dragging down the entire movie around them. And, a classic trope of old Hollywood styles of docudramas. And this is a movie that, as you said, knows when to get rid of them, and let's not drag them out throughout the course of the movie. Like, if they're important, give them the, fireworks scene, like a Mark Strong, in that boardroom moment, or James Gandolfini, basically deciding whether this mission should be going ahead. Stuff like that is great, and these character actors really bring it to life. They're employing them for what they do best, which is just come in, hit a home run, and walk out, without, in this case, really standing outside the vibe of the tone that Kathryn Bigelow is going for. Like, they all work really well within, and it's a cast that I'm sure probably this was the perfect moment for them all to be assembled coming off of the Hurt Locker. Every actor wants to be part of something like that in the wake of that, and boy, like, what a cast. And obviously a number of all-stars going forward. Chris Pratt would become a movie star a couple of years later in Guardians. Yeah, really crazy. Edgerton as well. Yeah.
Well, what about you, Cam? And if your answer is this is the film that led to Chris Pratt having the abs in Guardians of the Galaxy, that answer is completely fine, because I watched that film a lot.
Well, I mean, Kathryn Bigelow's filmmaking just cannot be underrated. You look at the entire siege at the end of this film, unbelievable filmmaking. I remember in the theater, just edge of your seat. You know the outcome, and it's one of those filmmaking achievements. You look at Titanic. Everyone knows how Titanic's going to end, but you just sit there gripped because of James Cameron's filmmaking through that entire end section. And here it's the same thing. That siege on the compound, unbelievable filmmaking. And just, I know that some of the SEAL team members have said, well, the tactics weren't accurate, but as portrayed on screen, like, you are just absorbed, and just her ability to capture the tension. And there's moments of tension throughout the movie. You can look as well at the meetup that the Jennifer L character sets up that goes wrong. Like, there's so much tension in that sequence, but like, this last 20 minutes is almost exhausting because you're just so gripped, even though we all know the outcome.
Yeah. I mean, and it's a situation where it's dark, it's chaotic, and yet we never lose track of what's happening, where people are. Like, there's a real sense of space to that. And I mean, that is masterful filmmaking. It really is. Because that could just be confusing and dull because you don't know what's going on. You don't know what the stakes are. Here, even just the littlest thing of, a child who's crying, or all these little pieces add up into this like tapestry of tension. It's really astonishing.
And even the execution of Bin Laden is done so quickly. Like, it doesn't glorify the moment. It doesn't do the action hero kind of takedown. It's so quick.
Yep.
And it, I think, kind of touches on that there is no great satisfaction over his death because it's so quick. It's like they say to the soldier who did it, like, do you realize what you just did? And he's like, he kind of has that moment of like, no, I didn't really think about it. And you have Maya at the end of the film sitting with, the body, and it's like, what now? Like, that's been my entire life.
Yeah.
And it's over, and I have no idea where I'm going now.
Yeah, that's one of the more powerful things that the film says, is the very last shot on her is that she's just completely numb. She's, like you said, she's dedicated her whole life to this, and now it's done, and now what? And obviously, there's no bit in the film where people are cheering, or there's none of that. It's almost anticlimactic.
Mm-hmm.
Which was my fear going into it, was that sort of the jingoism, as I said before.
Yeah.
And it really isn't there, which
No.
I don't know why I seem to recall there was, but I think that was maybe just the closeness to the time it actually happened. And on that last scene, Cam, I completely agree. It's great. I wrote down it has like horror film vibes to it, just the way it's shot. And you get like little bits of people running in the background, and you're hoping your soldiers will make it out alive, even though you know exactly what happens to everyone involved in that operation. But it still manages to create that tension and that fear. And I think that's a very, very successful sequence.
Yeah, it's really just top tier filmmaking across the board, and just unbelievable to watch. And it was something that when I was revisiting it, you worry, like, the immediacy of seeing it the first time was pretty incredible. But, 10 years plus removed, it was very interesting. Or I guess just under 10 years. It was very interesting just to see how incredibly effective it still is, even after we have a better understanding of the real world events. At the time, this was like, it felt in 2012/13 when I saw it, more of a window into things you didn't quite know what had happened.
Well, I suppose I'll pivot us over into if there's any quibbles or things to nitpick with the film, any dislikes. The main one I'm going to talk about, and it's kind of personal, is that I've had some important things happening today in my life. And during watching this film, I had to be on hold to the bank. So for a good 25 minutes during the middle section of this film, I had to listen to a robot voice saying, "Your customer is very important to us. Please stay on the line." And then listening to Toto's Hold the Line on repeat. It was on low volume, but like, it did take me out of a couple of scenes. So I think Hold the Line by Toto has now been ruined for me because I will forever associate it with the killing of Osama bin Laden.
That's dark, Scott. That's real dark.
That's a zero dark.
Yeah. Times 30.
Yeah. But I'll throw it out. Like we've said, this film is quite the triumph, but I'm sure we'll all have a couple of things to nitpick about the film. MaryAnn, have you got something that springs to mind?
Well, I think probably the one was what I've already mentioned, which is the sort of the pro-torture aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really bothers me. There's all sorts of debates to be had about how accurate a movie has to be when it's based on something that's actually happened, when it's based on real people. And I go back and forth on that because, yes, movies have to tell a good story. A narrative film has to tell a good story. Sometimes you have to change the facts or create composite characters and things, to do that. No one should look at a film, even one that's based on real facts, and take that as their only knowledge about whatever the movie's about. But the reality is that people do that, and these movies are really influential. So maybe the fact that audiences are not that into this film is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the idea that torture works wasn't bolstered by this movie. But yeah, that is the one sour note for me in this. But beyond that, just the larger, because this is through the eyes of just the one character, Maya, the Jessica Chastain character, we don't have like larger geopolitical context for much of what we see. And again, like one movie can't do everything. So that doesn't bother me quite so much as how myopic it is about the torture stuff.
It is a conversation that we've had as well on the podcast, and one I think a lot of people just have in the world if you follow films and are really into films, is that how accurate does a biopic have to be? Especially, like, I think we've run into issues over the years and much more debates about movies like this that land very close to the events. Because Zero Dark 30, like, a lot of holes have been poked in terms of what it's portraying on screen. Obviously the effectiveness of the torture in the movie. The shifting of presidents in the movie is portrayed in a way that people have said, actually, this wouldn't have gotten done if Obama hadn't been president. And the movie doesn't really give you that indication as much. So, like, I don't know, like, MaryAnn, how accurate do you feel like these movies should be when they come out in the moment? Like, is it impossible to do because it's so messy and fresh even at the time?
I think it's probably more impossible to do it the closer it is to the events depicted. Certainly something like this where the events depicted were top secret for the longest time, and I'm sure we still don't know the whole story. So yeah, it's a tricky thing, and I still, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, when you see it, that this is getting it right, and this one's getting it wrong, and I feel like apart from the effectiveness of torture aspect of this movie, I think even if all the details aren't exactly right, even if the tactics that the SEAL team used to get into the compound weren't exactly accurate, I think that's probably okay, because it is giving you a general sense of what it took to do this job. Maybe at some point we'll get a rebuttal film they'll give us the true story of Zero Dark 30 and how they really got that intelligence that wasn't gotten through torture. I mean, these kinds of movies can be conversations with each other. We just need to keep that in mind when we watch movies like this, that, don't take this as gospel. This is maybe one part of the puzzle, could be an important part of the puzzle, but it's not going to be the whole story, even if it pretends to be.
I think for me with the torture stuff, what I was surprised about on my revisit was that it didn't shine a light on how useless that information usually is from torture, and was proven to be from these interrogations. Because the film doesn't really apologize. It really has that sort of ends justify the means spirit inside this film, and I maybe it would have bogged the film down if it spent another 10 minutes giving us a scene from some intel that proved to be wrong because it was just under duress. And maybe that's why we never saw that. But I just feel like if you're going to tell this sort of story, you need to point out that, okay, this stuff happened. That's fine. It's fact. But it doesn't mean anything because it's useless information. It shouldn't be done. I don't think this film went far enough to explain why it's bad and useless.
I mean, there could have been one character in one scene objecting, saying, look, we know we're not going to get anything useful from this guy, so why are we doing this? I mean, there could have been just that, just even if it just had that little bit. I mean, we can't deny that the torture did happen.
Mm-hmm.
We know that people were taken to black sites. I'm sure we don't even know all the horrible things that they did to them. So that happened, and there's no point in denying that. But surely there must have been somebody at the time who said, really, this is what we're going to do? Like, not only is it inhumane, it's also just not going to work. It's bad police work. And even if there wasn't someone at the time, because we're allowed to have a little bit of artistic license or journalistic license with these things, you could still have some character there saying, and it doesn't need to be, someone in every scene, just one person saying, really, this is probably not going to work.
Well, there's lots of scenes around tables where characters are talking about, process of going through what they need to do. You could easily have a character being like, we can't trust this sort of information. Like,
exactly.
It's not achieved through a means that's effective. You could easily just have that tossed off line where at least the audience can go, oh, someone acknowledged that. They're thinking what I might be thinking.
Exactly. And, there's one scene in the film where Jessica Chastain is talking to Jennifer Ehle, and they're talking about their tactics and what they're going to be doing. And there's a TV on in the background, and there's an interview with Barack Obama, and he's talking about how America does not torture, blah, all this stuff. And they pause just for a second to listen to that, and then they go right back to talking about torturing, basically. And I remember thinking at the time, back when the film was new, that I was like, oh, so that's the little bone they're going to throw to, the America doesn't torture thing. And I saw it a little bit in a little slightly more nuanced way this time, where I thought, okay, this is the film acknowledging the hypocrisy of it. If only there'd been just maybe a little bit more of that, so that it's not just that one sort of almost throwaway scene. A little bit more of an undercurrent of, I don't know. You don't want movies like this to go overboard either. It doesn't need to hit us over the head with, the fact that what these people are doing is not so great. But yeah, maybe just a little more tip in the other direction would have been welcome.
This movie has so much to offer in terms of process, in terms of just being a procedural, and yet so much of the conversation, as I think we're finding today, falls back on these torture scenes, right? Which, as depicted, are incredibly visceral because of Kathryn Bigelow's mastery of filmmaking. Is this sort of the kind of the blanket that hangs over this movie, even going forward this many years, that people still just kind of, I appreciate what this movie's doing, but these torture scenes really do kind of hang over and maybe even dampen my enthusiasm of the movie? Because it's a movie I feel like a lot of people appreciate more than they really love.
I don't even think it's the torture scenes per se, because you could cut those scenes out, but they're still acting on information that they supposedly have gathered from the torture.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the issue. It's not the depiction of torture per se. It's how torture is involved in the plot.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I think you're right that this is something that's always going to dog this movie.
It's also just not one of those films you'll stick on, really.
No,
and we said this earlier on. It's not.
It's not a comfort film.
No, not at all. And even if you're in the mood for some prestige,
yeah,
I don't think this would be a film you would reach for either, because it makes you uncomfortable. And I don't. And much as boundaries should be pushed, I think, especially in cinema, I just think that it is a piece of its time, but I don't think it will. It might hold up, but I don't think people will be going back to it.
Right. I think it does hold up, a decade later. But you're right, there is a difference between movies that you appreciate and movies that you love and go back to again and again. Mm-hmm. And yeah, this is not one that if I came across it flipping around on TV, I would go, oh, I gotta watch the rest of this one now. Like you might do with some other films.
I think we should talk just a little bit more about Jessica Chastain as the protagonist here, because I thought one thing that was really interesting about the movie on the revisit, I remember some of the criticisms around the movie, those that weren't necessarily as big of fans, would mention that this character was not a lot of interpersonal life in the movie. But I think on the revisit, I was really honing in on that, and that is the entire point of the character, which is we see several times, like when she goes out to dinner with Jennifer L. Jennifer L's like, oh, have you met anyone? Have you hooked up with anyone? Do you have any sort of anything going on? And the whole focus of this character, I think, is what is really interesting is the fact that she has no life. This is her sole focus. This is all she has. And I think is representative of, if not necessarily the person that they loosely based it on, the attitudes of so many of these CIA agents and military going through this experience of tracking down bin Laden.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we certainly see lots of male characters across genres that are like this. They're totally dedicated to the work. Yeah, that doesn't bother me at all. That makes perfect sense. And in fact, I loved that and I mentioned this in my original review. I love that there isn't a scene where there's some boyfriend or husband who's like, "You're more interested in getting bin Laden than you are in me." The movie did not need that at all. And it doesn't matter. Who cares what her personal life is like?
I also think that you can look at this movie too, where they reference, she was recruited out of high school. Clearly, this is someone that the CIA would recognize is the perfect asset you would plug into, cases like this, because they are going to have that single-minded focus.
Yeah, you want someone who's going to be this obsessive. They're going to get the job done.
Hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
I think she also works as just kind of an amalgam for the US and their quest to take down Osama bin Laden. I know she is a audience surrogate and she's a amalgamation of different people that helped work on this case, but I think she's also just that. She is the US's dog-eared must get Osama bin Laden, and that was their attention for 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah. I also love, if we had a male director, if this was Michael Bay, there would have been so much like sexualizing of her image on screen, and there's none of that. In fact, there's the one tiny bit, and it's not Bigelow's perspective, it's not the camera's perspective. When the first time she shows up at the embassy in Pakistan, and Jason Clarke and Kyle Chandler, I forgot to mention him, Kyle Chandler, he's amazing. Chandler's character is meeting her for the first time, and she's on the other side of a glass wall, so she can't hear what Clarke is about to say to Kyle, which is, "Was I wrong?" And what we are meant to infer is that he told Chandler, "This woman is absolutely stunning looking." And because they're both, he's seeing her for the first time. And that's it. That's the only comment. And it's perfectly plausible. But she's never treated by the characters on screen or by the camera in any sexualized way at all, which is like so refreshing.
Mm-hmm.
It's very nice to see. I was disappointed, as I said before, Chris Pratt didn't take his shirt off. That's just me.
If he'd been in the film a few minutes longer, perhaps he would have.
Maybe.
And Jessica Chastain is so good at playing people who have real authority over a situation. Mm-hmm. One of her real strengths, and she's one of those actors who whenever she's on screen, it's almost impossible to hide how smart she is. Like, it just comes across in all of her really good performances. I think of Molly's Game as well.
Oh, I love Molly's Game. I was going to mention that, yeah.
Like, she always can come across like the smartest person in the room, and no one will ever question it. Like, you buy it, mm-hmm. and when you have scenes with, like, Joel Edgerton is just gesturing to her, like, I'm confident because she's confident. Like, clearly, she knows exactly what's going on.
She has such authority on screen, mm-hmm. and it's rare that movies let women have that. And to see her just using that again and again and again on screen, it's so wonderful. I think she's so great. It's so funny. She's one of those people, somehow you get this image of what people must be like in person that you don't get on the screen. Like, she's very tiny, like height-wise. She's really small. And whenever I see her that shows the context of really how tiny she is, I'm always stunned because in my mind, she's like this towering figure.
Yeah.
Because of, the power that she has on screen. It's really astonishing. She's terrific. She's one of my favorites.
Do you think there's a little bit of a surrogate situation going on here with Kathryn Bigelow and this character of Maya?
Could be.
So you look at Kathryn Bigelow, starting out as like an action director in a very male-driven genre, and moving mm-hmm. into films like this. She's the only, at the time, the only female director to win, Best Director. So mm-hmm. she really is kind of running these massive shows in terms of directing a movie like The Hurt Locker and this. And you get a little bit of the comparison there with Maya.
I bet she has real empathy with Maya, with what she's going through. The way she has to push through in this male-dominated environment must be quite intimidating, at least when you get started. Yeah, I'm sure there's certainly an element of that mm-hmm. going on in this movie.
It's interesting and somewhat time appropriate that we're speaking about this film as well, because I recently had a discussion on Twitter with a few people about female representation in spy films, and I was calling out that we needed more female-led spy films, not just sub characters, wives and girlfriends. I want lead actors as played by women. And it's nice that we're covering this film because it's such a strong example that it can be done well, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing more of this.
Yeah.
Well, it's one of the reasons why I love the Melissa McCarthy movie Spy, because it is not only a female-led spy film, but the comedy of it is about undercutting the sort of the male dominance of the genre, and that's what makes it so enjoyable to me.
I haven't actually seen that film yet. I'm saving it for when we cover it, but I know Cam's a fan.
Okay.
Yeah.
It is not. I'm not the biggest Melissa McCarthy fan in the world, or at least I haven't been. And when the way this movie was sold to us, I thought, oh God, I'm going to hate this, and it's completely not what you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
It's not Austin Powers.
Isn't Mark Strong also in that?
He is. I think. Yeah, I think so.
My mind's fuzzy on that point, but yeah.
Right, yeah. Even without the wig, he's still sort of a fashion inspiration for me. Just with the build, but I think we're sort of wrapping up towards our final thoughts here. But does anyone have any additional notes we haven't brought up? Any points they want to talk about? I've actually done mine.
Yeah. I'll talk about the script by Mark Boal. This is a movie laden with jargon, terms that may lose people. And Scott, you and I have watched Bond movies where we're like sitting forward going like, what is the villain trying to do? Like, what is the plot at this point? And you look at how much they had to chronicle going, time-wise from 2003 to 2011 in this film. That's a lot to deal with. A lot of jargon coming from CIA characters they want to capture what these briefings could actually be like in a technical way. How do you communicate this to an audience? And the fact that you can sit and watch 2 hours and 40 minutes of this movie and never feel lost, that is a real testament to both the script and the filmmaking.
Yeah, I'll second that too. Yeah, you're right. It's just absolutely crammed full of workplace conversations, basically, with people using, their workplace jargon, and yet we follow it, no problem.
I think it's something that Argo does quite successful as well,
Mm-hmm.
with that sort of language, and it has also had that pressure of being set in the country where people are trying to kill you. And there was a moment where I did feel like I was watching Argo when she was attacked coming out of her house. That felt like it was straight out of Argo, so that was interesting.
I love Argo too. Argo is one that manages to be about real events, relatively recently. I mean, I'm just about old enough to remember the Iran hostage crisis, in the bigger sense of it being a big story on the news. And yet that's still completely escapist, and that's a fun movie, even though it's about, maybe it's because it didn't end terribly. It had it wasn't a disaster.
And the whole sci-fi thing running underneath it,
yeah,
the sort of the wackiness of the Hollywood side of things, maybe.
True. Good point.
Much more of a crowd pleaser.
It is. Yeah.
What about you, MaryAnn? Any final notes?
One thing I wanted to say was that the last bits, we were talking about James Cameron before, towards the end of the film where Chastain goes in and meets the SEAL team and they're talking about the helicopters and their stealth capabilities, and the guys want to know what the mission is, and she goes in and she tells them. I was suddenly so reminded of the scene early in Aliens where Ripley is briefing the Marines about what they're going to encounter on the planet, and I was like, wow, that had not occurred to me the first time. So maybe with the distance of time and being slightly less emotional about all of it, I was able to see sort of the more sort of like pure movie stuff going on here.
Also interesting because James Cameron and Kathryn Bigelow were married for a period of time.
They were, and she was like kind of a protege of his. Like they worked together. So yeah, you definitely see his influence in her work.
I didn't know that at all, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he produced Strange Days, which is a really fantastic movie that she directed as well.
Mm-hmm.
So
there you go.
Yeah.
Any final notes from folks?
Well, I just want to cite too the helicopter journey in. I thought was incredibly effective. Just like the tension, the mounting tension of that whole sequence, unbelievable.
Mm. I also would note the night vision view of that final assault. I've worn night vision goggles before, and she's nailed that. That looks terrific. Yeah, well, we've spoken about that final scene. We've all loved it. That's fine.
Yeah.
But I think it's time to skip on over to the knock list. And Cam, as we have a guest, do you want to just quickly explain what the knock list is?
Yes, the knock list is the tortured acronym for Need to See Official Classics of the Spy Hards podcast, where every week after we've talked about a movie, we determine whether it belongs on the list of, I hesitate to say like the all-timers, but the great spy films that you could hand off to people and they would watch them and be like, these really are entertaining spy films or important spy films that I get a lot out of. So movies that have made the list, 3 Days of the Condor, Argo made the list, several of the Bonds did, like the early Sean Connery ones, and GoldenEye as well, the Pierce Brosnan film. Hannah, starring Saoirse Ronan, made it on the list. So it's somewhat eclectic, but it's movies we think people need to see. Like, if you are into the spy genre, you should see these movies.
Absolutely. So, as you're our guest, MaryAnn, the first vote goes to you. Yes or no? Is it making, and why?
I would say yes, because purely for to counteract the fantasy aspect of the spy genre. This is what spycraft really is. It's hard slog work over a long period of time. It's not glamorous. It's not sexy. And also to show the real-life impact of what spy work has on the real world. So yes, I would say it goes on the knock list.
Okay. That's one yes. Cam, what have you got?
I'm a yes as well. I think it's a messy movie emotionally for people to revisit now. And I think that's actually important because it will give you insight into how people were feeling at the time. Like, people were grappling with this situation. And I think it's one that really taps into that feeling. But just filmmaking wise, as a procedural, it's gripping. It's top level filmmaking. I don't really have any quibbles with it in terms of, you know, a 2-hour, 40-minute film experience, other than, as we've talked about, some of the moral issues and, you know, the torture elements and, you know, whether the movie is truthful about how effective they were. But again, it's so much tied to a time and place. And I think you can look at a lot of older movies. Let's watch some of those old 1940s John Wayne World War II movies and compare those to, you know, the situation at the time. And they seem like cartoons. This, to me, feels honest to how people were feeling at the time. So I think it's an important time and place movie, time capsule movie. And Jessica Chastain's performance alone is just towering. And as MaryAnn said, it's a spy movie that actually shows genuine spycraft at work, no glitz and glamour, just portrayed as it is, and, you know, obviously at a top level. So for me, it's a yes.
Well, it's my favorite because when we have 3 votes and we have 2 yeses, I'm basically defunct at this point. There's no reason for me to speak, so I should probably just end the show anyway. But here we are. I'm going to vote no, and it's purely because of Mark Strong's hair.
Come on.
Because I'm insanely jealous, and I want to know who his horse manicurist person is. You know, I need to have that connection, and I'll make the call. Don't worry. No, I'm kidding. It's a. I'm not going to say masterpiece. I think few films make masterpiece level, but it's certainly a terrific film in terms of creating a film, in terms of the tradecraft of filmmaking. The film likes saying the word tradecraft. You can't put it down. It keeps your attention for 2.5 hours, which is something that a lot of other films can't say, including No Time to Die. And as Cam said, Jessica Chastain is fantastic. Yes, there are some problems with it. The torture stuff maybe doesn't really show you the reality of it all and really shine a light on the problems with that type of torture. But this works as an encapsulation of the vibe that was being felt by at least America during this time period. They didn't need to justify the means. They wanted to just get that end goal of getting Osama bin Laden. And I think this film depicts that pretty well. And I think it would be missing from the knock list if it didn't make it on. So I will give it my stamp of approval.
Okay.
And as such, that's 3 yeses, and 0Doc30 is making the knock list. MaryAnn, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us this evening.
Thank you again. It's been a real pleasure.
Now, we'll have notes in the show notes below, but tell us a little bit about the website, where people can find it and people can find you.
Well, the site is flickphilosopher.com, and that's philosopher with an F, but if you type in philosopher spelled the normal way, you will find the site, because I registered all the alternate domains. Also, if you just Google MaryAnn Film Critic, it'll pop up. I think I'm the only film critic called MaryAnn, so that's easy enough to find.
Wow.
There you go.
No, and that's not actually true, but there's very, very few of us. I think I can think of one other.
And MaryAnn, we'll have to get you back for a lighter spy film in the future, one that doesn't involve excessive scenes of torture.
That would be absolutely delightful. Perhaps Spy itself.
Oh, okay.
When you get around to that one.
You're pitching yourself for a film.
I'm
I quite
pitching
like
myself,
it.
yes.
I like it. But yes, and on Twitter,
I'm on
find you
Twitter
there?
at MaryAnnJohanson.com. But you'll find all those links are on Flick Philosopher.
Cool.
And you've got some really good articles on your website. I know you sent me one over about sort of representation in Hollywood and directors and things like that as well. So that's it's not just reviews; it's other things.
It's all film related. Yeah, I did a whole year-long project where I looked at the representation of women on screen. How well they're are they the central characters in the stories? Are they just depicted as sexual objects? So check that out.
Absolutely, and we'll have links to all of that in the show notes below. But again, MaryAnn, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, Cam, we've thoroughly decoded Zero Dark 30, but I'm curious, what are we doing next week?
Well, we are not changing the pace at all, Scott. More of the same. You watch Zero Dark 30, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to jump right into 2002's Spy Kids 2, Island of Lost Dreams.
Oh, shiitake mushrooms. It's back, baby. I can't wait.
Is this the most whiplash transition from movie to movie we've ever had?
I mean, what did we do before we did One of Our Dinosaurs is Missing?
I guess anything next to one of our dinosaurs was probably a bit of whiplash as well.
Yeah. This is what we do here. We change it around every week. It'd get boring if we just did Bonds every week, I'm sure. So I appreciate you all following along. And speaking of appreciate, we recently launched our Patreon. And part of that, we've got some exciting stuff coming up. We've got some great patrons on board already, and that number is growing. But Cam, tell the listeners a little about what we've had already and what we've got coming up.
Yes, so we've got our Agents in the Field series, and we've put out episodes on The Rock, The Sting, and Jaws the Revenge. And the focus of this series is to look at popular spy actors in some of their other famous films. And we've also put out some commentaries. We have GoldenEye is out for you to listen to and hear us journey along the adventures of James Bond in Pierce Brosnan's debut. And so that is really worth checking out. And we're going to have some commentaries coming up on some pretty cool movies. So check those out.
Yeah, we've got some great tiers, different options for patrons as well, some affordable options and some higher tiers as well to access things like the commentary. So drop on over to patreon.com/spyhards to find out more, and there'll be links in the show notes below. But of course, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to check out Spy Kids 2 and join us next week. We are, of course, proud members of Quite the Thing and Podbreed podcast networks. You can find out more about those on their respective websites. Don't forget to follow us discreetly on social media at Spyhards, that's SPYHARDS, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners, we don't know what we don't know.